Yeah, let's talk about this inductive bias thing more because I think this is a really important point, and it's something that will probably be obvious to a lot of our listeners as we explain it a bit more. When we think about the LLMs that we have today, they can't, as far as I know, maybe you can correct me on this, but I think they're quite limited in the extent to which they can induce some kind of conclusion beyond something that is in their training data. So that is quite unlike human cognition, where we don't just depend on the information given. We can use inductive biases, the priors we were talking about earlier, assumptions, to make some kind of guess as to what's happening in situations that are quite different from any that we have ever encountered in our life experience before. And as far as I know, any of the AI systems that we have today really struggle in that kind of circumstance.
I think in some ways this is I would say this is a little more of an open question, right? To what extent this is possible. The things I can say about it are there are certain kinds of generalization that we know large language models can do. So some of my colleagues here at Princeton have a nice demonstration of this where you can sort of get them to compose ideas together, right? So you can sort of give them a set of properties and then they can produce something new, which is the consequence of combining those things together. And it's certainly not something that ever existed because those things hadn't been combined together before.
For
Right.
sure. That is something that kind of that blending of content and style is very impressive. So something like, give me, explain this Shakespeare sonnet in the style of Snoop Dogg or something like that,
Yep.
which for sure you end up with an output that is unlike anything we've ever seen before.
Well, I mean, that's sort of challenging this idea that they can't do something that's not in their training data, right? So I think that's not strictly true. They're able to do this kind of, we call it compositional generalization, right? They're able to compose things that they've seen and make new things, and they can do that up to some depth, right? I think the interesting question is, are they able to kind of like uh, produce things that are genuinely novel in the sense of maybe not even being recognizably composed out of things that you've seen before, right? Like come up with a completely new artistic style rather than something which is a blend of styles in a way that's novel or something like that. And I think that's a question where it's still much more of an open question. We in my lab have looked at some questions related to this. So I have a postdoc, LLU, who's been looking at some related things, looking at creativity in these models. And I can tell you sort of hot off the presses some of our results there. But one of the things that she's found is that if we ask LLMs to come up with sort of novel product ideas, they actually do slightly better than people in terms of producing ideas that people rate as novel. And interestingly, a strategy that works for people, which is asking them to sort of do this by forming an analogy, right? So you say, come up with a new idea for a toaster where it's using principles that come from, how octopus suckers work or something, That's a good way of making humans extra creative, but it turns out not to work for large language models. And one reason why that might be the case is that the language models are already operating with such a broad sort of like set of concepts that they don't need that extra external stimulation in order to come in. And so there are ways that, it seems like they can do some kinds of creativity. I think the thing that we haven't seen is something where they're sort of like genuinely coming up with something that we can recognize as a sort of breakthrough. One of my favorite, thing to do whenever a new model comes out is like ask it to come up with ideas for scientific, studies that we could do. And, sometimes they get a little bit interesting, but I think it's also worth remembering that because the models are trying to produce things that have high probability, right? They're trying to produce high probability sequences of tokens. They're going to be pretty conservative in the things that they do. So they're not going to suggest something that's completely wacky because they've not been trained to do that. They've been trained to produce things that are like with high probability based on the things that they've seen before. And so if you think about an important part of creativity is just like being completely out of the box, that completely out of the box behavior is something which is maybe inconsistent with the way in which they're trained.